You're listening to Your Magical Midlife. This podcast is for women who are seekers, dreamers, and unconventional thinkers. If you're a Gen X woman who's always walked your own path, but now feel like you've lost your way, listen up. I'm Kate Higgins, your host. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and coach, and I'm here to guide you back to yourself and to help you reconnect with your joy, your passion, and your purpose. Midlife knocked me sideways. I was not prepared for all the challenges that piled up one by one. Everything in my life felt like it was imploding, including my health and my sense of self. By the time I hit 50, I was completely lost. But here's the good part. I'm finding my way, and so can you. I'll be dropping episodes every Thursday on everything from ambivalent aging, to body changes, to relationship shifts, to career challenges, financial fears, crazy family dynamics, and spiritual awakenings. Some weeks I'll be musing, some weeks I'll be ranting, and sometimes I'll have amazing guests who will share their expertise with you. Midlife brings a lot of change and a lot of challenges, but there's also so much magic to be uncovered. Let's dive in. First of all, thank you so much for returning to listen to this podcast after I took a little break. I was more affected by my dad's death than I realized, and I really needed some time to get my head together and get my thoughts together. And that's actually pretty pertinent to what I'm going to talk about today. I spent my 20s and my 30s not really thinking about my future. I didn't really think about what I would want my older life to look like, or what I would want to have or be in my 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I didn't think much of it. I didn't really think about getting married and having kids other than in this sort of vague someday, maybe, if I find the right person, if it's the right time, if I have enough money. All of those things. I didn't plan for it or make any kind of concrete decisions around it, which makes me think maybe I didn't want it that much. So after my dad died, I was hit with a surprising wave of grief. Not so much about him specifically. My dad and I had a very difficult relationship. He was a very selfish person, a very self-absorbed person, a very self-centered person. He wasn't the kind of dad that taught you lessons. He wasn't the kind of dad that imparted wisdom. He was the kind of dad that focused on his own needs and himself to the detriment of everyone, including my mother and myself, and presumably my brother, although my brother's life looks much more together and traditional than mine. The wave of grief that I was hit with after my dad died was more about the intrinsic loneliness of being a woman without children. I didn't really try to have kids. I kind of did a half-heart attempt to have children in my early 40s, when I realized that I was running out of time. I coerced my part-time boyfriend at the time that maybe it would be, fun to have a kid together. Maybe it's something we should try. And he was pretty ambivalent. I think he was wanting to make me happy. And I think he knew that he was not financially stable. And I think he also knew that it probably wasn't a great idea due to our mutual financial and emotional and spiritual instability at the time. At the time, I was still a nightlife performer part-time. I lived in a crappy one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. He had just been laid off from a job. It was just not a great time. So after my dad died, I was thinking very hard and long and deep about my life. And I was hit with a wave of absolute thunderous grief that I had somehow dropped the ball on being a parent and having what other people would think of as the right kind of life. And I felt really, really angry at both of my parents for not giving me or imparting me the tools to have a quote unquote normal life. And I really beat myself up about it. I'm not ashamed to admit, but I'm surprised to admit like how deep that programming is. That programming that the right kind of life is to get married, to move to the suburbs, to have a house with a white picket fence, to have 2.5 kids, 2 cars, 2 vacations, 2 incomes, all of those standard things. And to have that life and then just be in this like static existence of it and live happily ever after until you die at 76. And nothing in my life, as it is now, would point to evidence I ever wanted that. And I know that. I made active choices to not have that. I looked at the home I grew up in. I looked at my parents' marriage, and I resoundingly said, no, thank you. So why am I grieving, and why am I surprised that at 53, which is how old I was when my dad died, and at 54 now, I still have so much sadness and ambivalence that I don't have what everybody is supposed to have. And if I focus that truly and solely on myself, I could feel really bad. And then I pull back a little bit and I look at my friends, and very few of them had kids. And I pull back a little bit more to my extended social circle of acquaintances and people I've known in my various incarnations of therapist, social worker, nightlife performer, burlesque performer, goth girl, club girl, New York City girl. Most of my friends, most of my acquaintances, most of the people I've known have ended up for one reason or another without children. Most of whom also ended up for one reason or another without a traditional marriage or partnership. And I think it's interesting. I think it's a social commentary on Gen X sort of resoundingly rejecting, and I think a lot of millennial women resoundingly rejecting what was presented to us as this is what you should aspire to be. And I'm not saying it's better. I'm not saying like being without kids is better. I'm not saying being with kids and having that tradition is better either. I'm just saying that I think that if I had had a happier childhood, I think that if my mom had not been a severe alcoholic, and that's definitely a reflection for another episode, I think my life would have been very, very different. And I don't know. I was going to say I think I would have been happier, but I'm not sure about that either. I definitely would not have been able to do all the things that I've done had I been a parent. I don't think I would have been able to, well, I know I wouldn't have been able to perform and tour. I don't think I would have been able to quit my job on a whim. I wouldn't be living here in Florida with this lovely human that I live with. I don't know who I would have been. And you can't go back in time and you can't change that. But it's an interesting reflection to have that maybe not having children was not exactly a choice, but just something that happened. I didn't actively choose no kids for me. I didn't actively choose let's have a family. This is just what happened. And I'm still working around making peace with it. I don't even know if what I'm saying is coherent. I know that I don't aspire to live my existence out alone, and I'm happy I don't have to. I'm just not really sure what this is all going to look like for all of us who are in unconventional partnerships, who don't have children, The paradigm has shifted. It used to be that a woman who didn't have kids ended up being an old maid, ended up being that childless cat lady that got trotted out during the last election cycle as like this horrible spinster ghost. There's a word for it. Specter of a life that's filled with disappointment and regret and sadness. And my life is definitely not filled with disappointment, regret, and sadness. There are definitely times I wish I had had children. There are definitely times I wish I had had the life experience of being able to pass down knowledge, pass down wisdom, pass down ideas, pass down love. I wish I had had someone to nurture from the very moment that they were born. But that's not what happened, and that's okay. And I'm going to have to reckon with this a little bit more. And I'm sure, I know, actually, that I'm not alone with this. A lot of people are exactly where I am. And I see a lot of bravado, like, I never wanted kids, and I'm glad to have my freedom. I'm glad to have this. I'm glad to have that. And if that's where you are, that's great. But maybe someday you'll have a twinge of ambivalence like I'm having now. And maybe it will be after your second parent dies. And it's just you alone in the world. I think that's really what it was. I think that was the trigger now that I'm thinking out loud and musing about it. And clearly I'm doing this episode with no notes. It was when my second parent died and I realized that I was floating alone in space without a family. And that was a very untethering, unmoored experience. And it still is. I'm still processing it. I would absolutely love if you would think about this in the context of your own life. If you're a woman who has no children, especially if you're a woman who's either in an unconventional partnership or you're LBGT person with an unconventional situationship, I would love to know how you are feeling if you're unparented and you don't have kids. I would love your reflections. Please send me an email at yourmagicalmidlife@gmail.com because I want to know. I want to know if this is something that resonates with you. I want to know if you have ambivalence. I want to know if you have grief. I want to know if you feel joy. I want to know how you feel about being 45 plus and not having kids. This season is going to be amazing. I'm so excited to bring you new interviews, new reflections, new thoughts, new ideas, and I'm looking forward to sharing it all with you. And I'll talk to you next week. Have a great one. Thank you so much for listening to Your Magical Midlife. I'm Kate Higgins, your host. You can follow me on Instagram at yourmagicalmidlife, and you can check out my offerings on my website, yourmagicalmidlife.com. I offer individual and small group coaching, as well as luxury retreats for women in midlife and beyond who are seekers, dreamers, and unconventional thinkers. You can book a complimentary discovery call in the calendar link in my show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or share this episode with a friend. And I will talk to you next week.